Bright lights glimmered off the polished floors of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport as Ebony Davis, poised in her sleek business attire, approached the gate. Heads turned, some in idle curiosity, others with pointed stares. She clutched a first-class ticket she'd purchased with pride, but a tense hush soon fell over the boarding area. Moments later, a haughty flight attendant demanded Ebony move to economy, dismissing her seat as if it were reserved for someone more fitting. Little did they know, this poised black woman held a quiet bombshell of $5 million donation receipt earmarked for that very airline's charity foundation. The stage was set for an unforgettable confrontation. Ebony Davis never intended to become the center of a viral airport spectacle. In fact, she preferred to keep a low profile. Raised in a loving home in rural Georgia, she had learned resilience from an early age. Her mother, Althea, was a schoolteacher who spent her evenings tutoring children who couldn't afford extra help. Her father, James, worked at a local community center, organizing after-school programs to keep kids off the streets. Both instilled in Ebony the values of humility, tenacity, and an unwavering sense of justice. Growing up, Ebony often saw her mother discriminated against at work. Althea was the only black teacher in a predominantly white school district. She never let that deter her from her mission to educate. Neither Ebony's mother nor her father raised their voices when confronted with adversity. They just kept working toward positive change, modeling that quiet strength. Perhaps it was that steady example that guided Ebony as she blossomed into a tall, elegant woman with a knack for business. By her mid-20s, she had transformed a small-scale community fundraiser into a full-fledged philanthropic foundation, thanks to a combination of savvy marketing and deep empathy. Her non-profit Bridging Tomorrow specialized in building educational infrastructure in underprivileged areas across the country. Ironically, Ebony's success had caught the attention of corporate giants, including Delta Airlines, headquartered right there in Atlanta. Months before, Ebony had been invited to a gala fundraiser at the Delta headquarters, where she had shaken hands with executives and was lauded as a shining example of what philanthropy could look like in the modern world. Back then, Ebony had already been in talks about a significant donation to Delta's own charitable wing, which offered scholarships and travel opportunities to low-income students pursuing higher education. Though Ebony had initially hesitated, knowing that large corporations often face scrutiny for how they allocate charitable funds, she eventually decided to trust Delta's newly formed partnership program. That very decision brought her to this day. She was traveling on Delta for a follow-up meeting with some of the airline's key executives in Seattle. It was a chance to finalize the $5 million donation that Ebony had worked tirelessly to raise, combining her personal funds, her organization's resources and contributions from private donors who believed in her cause. So as Ebony stepped into the bustling terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson, she was filled with a calm confidence. Wearing a tailored gray pantsuit, she looked every bit the successful philanthropist she had become. A black leather bag embossed with her foundation's logo hung over her shoulder. Inside it, snugly tucked away, lay the official receipts and contracts for the $5 million donation. She had no idea that within the next few hours, her resolve would be tested in a public and humiliating manner, challenging not only her personal dignity, but the very values she had championed her entire life. Ebony arrived at the Delta check-in counter early precisely, as her organized nature demanded. She handed over her passport and first-class ticket to the agent, a kind-faced woman in her 40s. After tapping at the keyboard for a few moments, the agent returned Ebony's documents with a smile and a polite, "Have a wonderful flight." Ms. Davis. Security was a breeze. Ebony was a frequent traveler, well accustomed to the checkpoints and procedures. However, even in her years of traveling, she never took for granted the double takes or the suspicious glances. The repeated secondary screenings that she and other black travelers sometimes endured had formed a patchwork of microaggressions she'd grown adept at ignoring. Waiting at the gate, Ebony focused on her laptop, revisiting the final draft of the press release detailing her major donation. She planned to have it ready for distribution once the meeting concluded in Seattle. The donation would fund a new scholarship program for minority students in aeronautics, something Ebony was passionate about, as it aligned perfectly with Bridging Tomorrow's mission to expand educational opportunities. All seemed well until Ebony noticed subtle signs of tension brewing around her. A middle-aged white woman, impeccably dressed in a designer suit, kept sneaking glances at Ebony's boarding pass. Another passenger, a tall man in a crisp blazer, shot Ebony a look she knew all too well, a mix of confusion and suspicion. Ebony brushed it off at first, attributing it to the usual curiosity about who sits in first class. As the boarding process began, Ebony followed the announcement for first-class passengers. She stepped forward, ignoring the stares and focusing on the rhythmic beep of the scanner. The gate agent welcomed her, courteously scanned her ticket, and let her pass. Ebony offered a polite smile and walked down the jet bridge, determined to settle into her seat and enjoy the brief respite before takeoff. But the tension she had sensed earlier followed her. Once she was on the plane, Ebony gently placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment and sank into her wide, plush seat. A flight attendant with a name tag that read Madison paused at Ebony's row. Madison's smile was thin, almost forced. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right seat?" she asked, glancing at Ebony's boarding pass. Ebony remained composed. She handed her pass to the flight attendant. "Yes, 2A. Ebony replied, her voice steady and courteous. Madison glanced at the pass, looked Ebony up and down in a way that made Ebony's skin prickle with discomfort, then handed the pass back without a word. She moved on, but Ebony could still feel the flight attendant's eyes on her, as if quietly assessing whether Ebony actually belonged in first class. Little did Ebony know this was just the precursor to a scene that would soon unfold, one that would test the airline's public image and her own resilience in the face of prejudice. Shortly after settling into her seat, Ebony noticed the atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifting. Passengers who boarded after her began to whisper among themselves, stealing furtive glances in her direction. It was subtle at first, then more blatant. One woman, wearing pearls and carrying a designer tote, blatantly leaned toward her seatmate and murmured, "I didn't know they oversold first class like this." The seatmate shrugged but offered Ebony a fleeting apologetic glance. Ebony had learned to navigate these coded remarks with silent poise. Yet even her well-practiced grace was tested when Madison, the flight attendant from earlier, returned with what appeared to be an air of self-importance. Madison stood in front of Ebony's seat, flanked by a second flight attendant, a younger man named Casey. Ma'am Madison began, her tone exuding a brisk authority. "We have a situation with seating. We're going to have to ask you to move to economy." For a moment the cabin seemed to freeze. Ebony's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She arched an eyebrow politely. "I'm sorry, why would I have to move? I have a first-class ticket." Madison's gaze flickered toward Ebony's carry-on, almost as if implying Ebony had somehow sneaked her way into the seat. "There seems to be a mix-up, and we need to accommodate another passenger who's expecting first class." The hush in the cabin grew more pronounced. Ebony scanned the other faces in first class, noticing the sly nods and the silent approval some were giving to the flight attendant. Others looked uncomfortable, as if they sensed something was off, but didn't dare speak up. Ebony inhaled slowly. She didn't want a confrontation, but she also wasn't going to be bullied out of the seat she rightfully paid for. "If there's a misunderstanding," she replied calmly, "I can show you my ticket receipt. I paid for 2A. I was confirmed at check-in. There's no mix-up on my end." Madison maintained her rigid stance. "Ma'am, if you'd just gather your belongings and follow me to economy, we can sort this out later. We need to push back from the gate on time." Ebony's eyes narrowed slightly. She recognized the tactic pressure the passenger into compliance with mentions of scheduling and airline protocol. But Ebony had every legal and moral right to remain in her assigned seat. Before she could speak again, she heard a faint, mocking laugh from somewhere behind her, fuel for the fire that was heating her veins. "Madison," with all due respect, Ebony said evenly, "I'm not moving unless there's a legitimate reason. If someone else has a first-class ticket, they'll need to speak with the gate agent." The flight attendant's lips thinned into a line of displeasure. Tension rippled through the cabin passengers, craning their necks to watch how the standoff would unfold. Ebony's heart hammered, but outwardly, she radiated a calm determination, a determination that would soon lead her to unearth a powerful piece of evidence from her bag. Madison leaned closer to Ebony, lowering her voice in an attempt at composure that nonetheless trembled with indignation. "Look, if you don't move voluntarily, we have the right to remove you from the flight." Ebony felt a surge of anger mingle with a lifetime of practiced restraint. A part of her wanted to lash out, to declare how unjust this was. Another part, grounded by years of watching her parents handle racist undertones with dignity, urged calmness. She glanced at Casey, the younger flight attendant. He seemed uneasy, shifting from foot to foot, his eyes darting between Ebony and Madison. "Ma'am, we really need your cooperation," he said softly, as if trying to diffuse the tension. Ebony set her jaw. "You don't need my cooperation if I'm legally seated," she said, her voice measured. "I paid for this seat, and unless Delta has made a mistake, it can prove I'm not moving." At that moment, a low rumble of conversation pulsed through the first-class cabin. A few passengers muttered in agreement, while others seemed eager to see Ebony ousted. Across the aisle, a silver-haired man fiddled with his phone camera, discreetly recording the exchange. Madison's composure was unraveling. She hissed in Ebony's ear, "Don't make this difficult for everyone. People like you." She stopped abruptly, as though catching herself before finishing that sentence in front of an audience. Ebony's eyes flashed. "People like me? What does that mean?" she demanded, her voice rising just enough to be heard by the nearest passengers. Madison straightened, glancing nervously at the cameras she realized were pointed at her. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly, then continued in a steely tone. "I'm following procedure. If you won't comply, I'll have no choice but to get the captain involved, and possibly the authorities." A few rows back, Ebony heard gasps. The word authorities carried a loaded weight, especially given the number of incidents where black passengers had been forcibly removed or mistreated. Anxiety coiled in Ebony's stomach, but she remembered her father's lessons. Stand for what's right, but always protect yourself. With deliberate calm, Ebony reached into the black leather bag at her feet. She pulled out 2 documents, her e-ticket receipt for seat 2A and a folder containing official paperwork for her $5 million donation to Delta's charitable foundation. She held up the e-ticket first. "Here is my official boarding pass and purchase receipt for seat 2A. In first class, Ebony said, voice clear for everyone around to hear. Then she flipped open the folder to a prominent, eye-catching letterhead bearing Delta's logo. And here is the memorandum of understanding for my $5 million donation to this airline scholarship program. I doubt the CEO would appreciate me being harassed out of a seat I rightfully paid for. A ripple of shock coursed through the cabin. This was no ordinary passenger dispute. It had just escalated into a potential PR nightmare for Delta. Madison's eyes bulged momentarily, flicking between Ebony's documents and the watchful passengers. The tension in the air crackled on the brink of igniting a much bigger confrontation. As Ebony's words hung in the air, the entire first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath. Madison stood there, face reddening, while Casey's expression shifted from uncertainty to alarm. Passengers were no longer just passive observers. They were leaning forward, some capturing the scene on their phones, fully aware this moment could explode across social media within minutes. From behind, Madison came a crisp voice. "What's going on here?" asked a man with captain's stripes on his shoulders. Captain Jonathan Reeves, tall and confident, approached with the authority that came from years of flying. Madison inhaled sharply, stepping aside to let him address Ebony directly. Ebony, rising slightly in her seat to project composure, explained the situation concisely. She pointed to the e-ticket and donation documentation. She made sure the captain understood she was not merely an ordinary passenger. She was a key donor whose philanthropic contribution could help shape Delta's public image for years to come. Yet Ebony also emphasized that her status as a donor should never have been necessary to validate her right to remain in the seat she purchased. For a few seconds, the captain studied Ebony's documents. Then he turned a stern gaze on Madison. "Is there a legitimate reason this passenger is being asked to move?" he demanded. Madison stuttered. "There was a seating discrepancy. A double booking." Captain Reeves glanced at Casey, who looked at the floor. "Did we double book seat 2A?" the captain asked. Casey mumbled. "Not according to the system. Everything shows Ms. Davis is the rightful occupant." A hush fell over the cabin, broken only by the faint hum of the plane's ventilation system. Madison's face twitched. Her authority had been publicly undercut, and she could feel the eyes of the passengers drilling into her. Yet Ebony could tell Madison was grappling with anger and embarrassment, emotions likely to feed any latent prejudice. Captain Reeves cleared his throat. "Ms. Davis, I apologize for this confusion," he said, formally, handing her documents back with careful respect. "You are, of course, welcome to remain in your seat. We appreciate your generosity to Delta's charitable programs." Relief washed over Ebony, but her shoulders remained tense. She nodded politely, accepting the captain's apology on the surface, but keeping her guard up inside. The captain turned to the rest of the first-class cabin and announced, "We will be departing soon. Please settle in for takeoff." As he left, Ebony briefly caught his eye. She saw a flicker of remorse or maybe embarrassment. He knew what this looked like, especially in the era of viral videos and social justice movements. Madison, meanwhile, stood frozen, her fists clenched at her sides. Finally, she muttered a barely audible apology and strode away, head bowed. For Ebony, the immediate battle was won, but she had a sinking feeling the war was not yet over. The hush that followed was thick with unease. The hidden ugliness Madison's insinuations, her willingness to invoke procedure to target Ebony, lingered like a noxious gas. Ebony reminded herself that while she might have asserted her right to the seat, prejudice rarely dissipated with a single confrontation. What Ebony didn't yet realize was that she was about to be tested again, not just by one disgruntled flight attendant, but by a series of unfolding events that would sweep her into a firestorm of controversy headlines and soul-searching. With the cabin doors finally sealed, the plane taxied onto the runway. Ebony's mind whirled, replaying the confrontation in her head. She couldn't ignore the fact that other passengers had captured the moment on their phones. Her carefully crafted public persona, built on service and philanthropy, could be tied to a high-profile fiasco if these videos went viral. She exhaled, pressing her back into the plush seat as the aircraft roared into the sky. Perhaps once they were airborne, the tension would subside. She tried to refocus on her upcoming meeting, mentally rehearsing the final details of the donation announcement and scholarship rollout. But calm was not to be hers, at least not yet. Shortly after the seatbelt sign blinked off, she felt a presence at her elbow. It was Madison again, her expression unreadable. For a tense moment, neither of them spoke. Ebony braced for another confrontation, but Madison offered a glass of water. Without making eye contact, Madison said, "I'm required to offer in-flight services to every passenger in first class, including you." The words dripped with a bitterness she was clearly struggling to conceal. Ebony took the glass politely. "Thank you." Madison lingered as if searching for a reason to say more. Then under her breath she murmured, "I hope you're proud of yourself." Ebony's eyes darted to Madison, who walked away briskly before Ebony could respond. Her heart clenched with a mix of anger and sorrow. She couldn't help but think of the thousands of stories of discrimination she had heard through her foundation's outreach stories, of talented black students being told they don't belong in certain prestigious schools or programs. The words might differ, but the sting was always the same. Passengers around her seemed to sense the tension. Some stared at Ebony with pity, others with confusion. A couple of them awkwardly buried their faces in magazines, clearly wanting to avoid involvement. Ebony tried to steel herself. She was no stranger to microaggressions. But today's events were more blatant. When the meal service began, Madison pointedly skipped Ebony's row, at first serving every other passenger, before turning back to Ebony. When she finally reached Ebony, her words were clipped. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked tersely. Ebony forced a tight smile. "Chicken, please." "That's all we have left," Madison replied snidely. Ebony let the remark pass, understanding it was pointless to engage in petty exchanges. Instead, she mentally documented each slight, each subtle jab, every dagger of prejudice. If there was one thing Ebony knew how to do thanks to her upbringing, it was to document injustice and systematically confront it. As the plane hummed toward Seattle, Ebony glanced at her phone. Even though it was on airplane mode, she wondered if the outside world was already aflame with the story of the black philanthropist in first class being asked to move to economy. She could only guess how swiftly or widely the videos would spread, and what impact this might have on her meeting at Delta's offices. One thing was certain. The seeds of confrontation had been sown, and the flight was only the beginning of a chain reaction that would shake both Ebony and Delta to their core. By the time the flight began its descent into Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Ebony felt more relieved than she expected. She had survived the tense flight, ignoring Madison's cold glances and dismissive behavior as best as she could. She only hoped the drama would end once the plane touched down. However, Ebony sensed the turbulence was far from over. As soon as passengers were allowed to turn on their phones, the air buzzed with the sounds of notifications pinging and beeping. A white-haired man in the row ahead of her She recognized him as the one who had discreetly recorded the confrontation, turned in his seat, and locked eyes with Ebony. He gave her a sympathetic nod, then returned to scrolling through his device. Somewhere in that sea of phones, Ebony's story was undoubtedly taking on a life of its own. She tried to maintain composure, but her curiosity got the better of her. The moment the cabin doors opened and she connected to the airport's Wi-Fi, her phone lit up. Messages poured in from friends, colleagues, and even acquaintances she hadn't spoken to in years. "Ebony, is this you in that viral video?" read one text. "I can't believe they did this to you." Read another. Her email inbox was equally chaotic, with subject lines like urgent media inquiry and interview request. A knot formed in Ebony's stomach. She glanced up to see Madison busily directing passengers to exit, ignoring Ebony as if she were invisible. Casey offered Ebony a small, apologetic wave. Stepping off the plane, Ebony entered the bustling concourse, the weight of anxious eyes trailing her. She glanced at her Twitter feed and saw Delta Airline's racism trending. The short clip of Madison asking Ebony to move to economy had been shared thousands of times. The commentary ranged from outrage to shock, with some netizens defending Ebony and others debating the airline's policies. Outside the gate, Ebony spotted a small group of onlookers, possibly local reporters or curious travelers who recognized her from the video. She took a deep breath and walked briskly toward baggage claim, hoping to avoid questions until she spoke with her PR team. Moments later, Ebony's phone rang. It was Delilah, her right-hand manager, at Bridging Tomorrow. "Ebony, have you seen social media?" Delilah's voice trembled with a mix of worry and excitement. "Yes," Ebony said, her own voice subdued. "We've been contacted by 6 news outlets already. They want your statement." Ebony sighed. "Let's hold off on an official statement until I meet with Delta's execs. I don't want to escalate things further until I know how they intend to respond." Delilah hesitated. "Are you sure the narrative is building fast?" "I'm sure," Ebony affirmed, knowing full well that controlling a media storm was like taming a hurricane. Still, she had a scheduled meeting with some of the top brass at Delta. The donation was still on the table, though Ebony's faith in the airline wavered. She needed to see how they would address the situation before finalizing anything. With that, Ebony ended the call, collected her luggage, and headed for the exit. Each step echoed with the question, how would Delta, a corporation she had hoped to support, handle this brewing firestorm? The Delta corporate headquarters in Seattle weren't as large as the main hub in Atlanta, but they still exuded an air of sleek professionalism. The building's glass facade reflected the cloudy sky, creating a moody ambiance that matched Ebony's unsettled emotions. She walked through the lobby with measured steps, acutely aware of the stares from employees who might recognize her from the viral video. Her appointment was with 2 key executives who had been championing the scholarship fund Ebony intended to support Vice President of Community Outreach, Patricia Markham, and Director of Corporate Philanthropy, Samuel Wong. Both had been enthusiastic about Ebony's vision and had worked closely with her team on the scholarship structure and disbursement timeline. Ebony stepped off the elevator on the 10th floor, where a receptionist greeted her politely. In the waiting area, she spotted a corporate promotional poster featuring smiling faces of diverse employees. The contrast between the poster's message of inclusion and Ebony's morning experience hung heavy in her mind. A few minutes later, Patricia emerged from behind a frosted glass door. She was a brisk woman with short, dark hair and a concerned expression. "Ebony," she said, extending her hand. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all that. We've seen the video." It's appalling. Ebony appreciated the immediate acknowledgement. She returned Patricia's handshake, noticing the strain around the VP's eyes. "I appreciate you saying that," Ebony replied, following Patricia into a meeting room. Samuel was already inside, pacing the length of the table. He looked up and hurried over. "Ebony, we value you and your partnership immensely," he said, earnestness radiating in his voice. "Let's talk this through. We want to do right by you." Ebony took a seat, setting her bag and the folder with donation documents on the table. She took a moment to gather her thoughts, then said calmly, "I was humiliated in front of an entire first-class cabin. I'm still not even sure if the attendant will face consequences. This situation has overshadowed the entire reason I'm here to finalize a $5 million donation that I had hoped would bring positive change." Patricia leaned forward, her voice firm. "We understand how damaging this looks for you and for Delta. The leadership is already drafting a public apology. We're investigating the flight attendant, Madison. We want to assure you we're taking this seriously," Samuel added. "Our social media team is working on a statement, but we wanted to speak with you first. We'd like your input on how to address this both publicly and internally." Ebony looked from Patricia to Samuel. Their sincerity was evident, yet she also sensed the underlying corporate damage control. If it weren't for the viral nature of the incident and Ebony's status as a major donor, she wondered if they would be so quick to respond. She inhaled slowly. "My priority is ensuring no one else, regardless of their background or ticket class, has to face such blatant discrimination. Words are great, but I want concrete steps, policies, training, accountability." Patricia nodded, scribbling notes. "We agree. We're drafting an action plan as we speak. That plan could include mandatory diversity training and better checks to prevent bias from affecting passenger experiences." The tension in the room was thick, yet Ebony felt a surge of cautious hope. If Delta was willing to transform this moment of crisis into meaningful change, perhaps her donation could still serve its purpose. But Ebony had learned to be wary of corporate promises. She needed more than lip service. She needed a commitment, and for that, she was prepared to push hard. For the next hour, Ebony, Patricia and Samuel huddled over draft statements and policy outlines. They discussed everything from immediate disciplinary actions to long-term cultural shifts within the airline. At Ebony's urging, Patricia contacted the Human Resources Department to request data on past passenger complaints related to racial discrimination. As Ebony studied the preliminary numbers, her stomach twisted. There had been multiple complaints over the years, some from black passengers, others from members of different racial and ethnic groups. Many were settled quietly, but Ebony saw a pattern: flight attendants or gate agents who felt emboldened to reseat passengers they deemed unfit for first class. She pushed the documents aside, a wave of sadness washing over her. "It's worse than I thought," she admitted softly. "I'm prepared to sign the donation, but only if Delta commits to a top-down overhaul of how you handle these incidents." Patricia nodded. "We have the power to implement new training programs. We can make them mandatory for all customer-facing employees." Samuel chimed in. "And we can create clearer protocols and channels for passengers to report discrimination. We can't erase the past, but we can definitely shape our future." Ebony tapped her manicured nails on the table, considering. She cleared her throat and said, "I'm willing to move forward, but I want transparency. The scholarship program is one thing. Educating the next generation in aeronautics is crucial, but that can't happen in a vacuum of corporate accountability. I need to know that every dollar I invest here won't be overshadowed by further acts of discrimination." Patricia stood up, straightening her blazer. I'll talk to the CEO personally. We'll get a timeline for these reforms laid out, and you'll be part of the oversight process. If you're comfortable with that, of course. Ebony nodded. I'd want nothing less. A knock at the door interrupted them. A breathless communications manager poked her head in. You guys need to see this, she said, her face pale. Someone has posted a second video. Apparently, the flight attendant made more remarks about Ebony after you all landed. Ebony's pulse quickened. What remarks, she asked, dread coiling in her gut. The communications manager held up her phone, showing a grainy video of Madison rolling her eyes during a post-flight debrief caught on a passenger's camera phone. Madison was audibly saying, well, maybe next time she'll know her place, and a few other unflattering comments about Ebony's attitude. Patricia's face darkened with anger. This is unacceptable, she said through gritted teeth. She turned to Ebony. I'm so sorry. Ebony stared at the video, a swirl of hurt and determination in her chest. This flight attendant's prejudice wasn't even hidden. The evidence was painfully clear. As Ebony swallowed the lump in her throat, she realized that even a $5 million donation wouldn't magically fix the deeply ingrained biases. It would take systemic reforms, strong leadership, and a willingness to confront the ugliness. Steeling herself, Ebony locked eyes with Patricia. Let's get to work, she said. I'm not walking away from this, but I'll do everything in my power to ensure that what happened to me never happens again under the Delta banner. Within 24 hours of Ebony Davis's now viral confrontation aboard Flight 4781, Delta Airlines scrambled to control the narrative. The video of Madison demanding that Ebony move to economy, followed by the quiet reveal of her $5 million donation receipt, had lit up every social media platform. Public outrage surged. At Delta Airlines, racism trended for 2 consecutive days. At first, Delta released a brief written apology on its Twitter and Facebook pages, but the outcry only intensified. Customers threatened to cancel frequent flyer memberships. Influencers called for boycotts. Civil rights advocates began organizing media panels. So Delta did something it rarely did in real-time crisis management. It elevated the apology to the highest level. The next morning, Delta's CEO appeared in a video posted to the airline's homepage and major news networks. Dressed in a navy suit, seated in front of the Delta insignia, his tone was sober. To Ms. Ebony Davis, he began, and to every customer who has ever felt disrespected, profiled, or unwelcome aboard our aircraft, we extend our deepest apologies. What occurred on Flight 4781 was unacceptable. We take full responsibility and are initiating immediate internal reviews as well as comprehensive staff retraining. He paused. Delta cannot and will not be a company where bias, overt or subtle, is tolerated. The message was clear. But for Ebony, sitting in her Seattle hotel suite, surrounded by her team, the video stirred more weariness than comfort. She watched it in silence, arms folded, phone buzzing non-stop beside her. Delilah, her manager at Bridging Tomorrow, glanced at her cautiously. That's a big statement coming from the top. Most CEOs hide behind PR fluff. Ebony nodded slowly. It's a start, she said. But it's also damage control. We both know if that video hadn't gone viral, this would have been swept under the rug. The sting of what happened hadn't dulled. Every time Ebony closed her eyes, she saw Madison's tight-lipped sneer heard her say, "People like you," and felt the weight of humiliation bearing down in front of strangers. That moment, as powerful as it had become in public discourse, still sat in her chest like a bruise. Outside the walls of her hotel, the story continued to snowball. Journalists begged for interviews. TV personalities debated the ethics of unconscious bias in first-class travel. One late-night host joked, "Apparently the only first-class requirement at Delta is knowing the right zip code." Ebony remained quiet intentionally. She declined all media requests except one, a live sit-down with Robin Roberts on Good Morning America. She knew Robin would bring empathy and gravity, not tabloid sensationalism. In the studio beneath soft lights and muted tones, Ebony appeared not as the victim of an airline mishap, but as a poised, measured force of nature. Robin leaned forward. "Ebony, when you were told to move, when you were questioned like that, what went through your mind?" Ebony didn't blink. "I thought of my parents. I thought of all the times they'd told me. Dignity doesn't need to shout, but it should never back down." Robin smiled, but her eyes welled. "And what do you hope comes from all this?" Ebony's voice steadied. "Real change. Not just a press release, not just a settlement. I want policy's oversight action. I want young black students to sit in first class one day without being seen as intruders." The interview went viral within minutes. Ebony's clarity, her refusal to play either martyr or aggressor, resonated deeply with audiences. She wasn't just another news cycle headline, she was a compass pointing toward overdue reform. Behind the scenes, however, the toll was mounting. Ebony barely slept. She ate in fragments. Each ping of her phone brought another opinion, another video, another call for her to speak louder or push harder. The weight of expectation of being the symbol and the solution began to press down. One night alone in her hotel room, Ebony opened her laptop and reviewed an early scholarship application from a young Latina named Isabel. The girl wrote about dreaming of becoming an aeronautical engineer, but fearing her immigrant status and low-income background would always hold her back. Ebony wept, not from sadness but from clarity. This is why she endured that flight, that confrontation, that ache. The fight wasn't for validation. It was for the doors she could open once they saw her standing there, refusing to leave. Later that week, Delta's leadership reached out again, this time with a revised proposal. In addition to the scholarship rollout, they offered Ebony a position on a new advisory board designed to oversee bias intervention, training passenger complaint processes, and public accountability metrics. Ebony agreed, but only after ensuring that quarterly data would be published, anonymous reporting would be available, and diverse passenger voices would be included. It wasn't enough yet. But it was a blueprint, and it had her name on it. She would never forget the humiliation. But now, she would never let it be the final word. While Ebony navigated the media storm and corporate damage control across the country in Delta's Seattle base, Madison was facing a reckoning of her own. The flight attendant, who had once stood tall with authority, now found herself caught in a whirlwind of scrutiny, and this time there was no aisle to strut down, no uniform to shield her from consequences. It began with whispers. After the viral video aired on national news and began dominating social media feeds, Madison noticed her co-workers' glances lingering too long. Conversations stopped abruptly when she walked into the break room. The same colleagues who had once laughed with her on long-haul flights now offered only strained smiles or quickly looked away. At first, Madison told herself it was just temporary discomfort, an overreaction. "They'll get over it," she muttered to herself. "It's not like I committed a crime." But inside, an uneasy feeling had begun to brew. That feeling deepened when she received a formal summons from Human Resources. The meeting took place in a small, soundproof conference room. The walls were bare, except for a framed poster about Delta values, integrity, respect, and inclusion. Madison couldn't bring herself to look at it. She sat across from a composed HR officer, a legal compliance representative, and her union advocate. The air was clinical, the tone direct. "We've received multiple complaints regarding your conduct on Flight 4781, the HR officer began. These include allegations of discriminatory behavior, verbal intimidation, and abuse of authority toward a first-class passenger, Ms. Ebony Davis." Madison's face flushed. This is all being blown out of proportion. She was confrontational from the start. "We've reviewed passenger recordings," the compliance officer interrupted, "including post-flight comments you made during debrief. They played one of the clips grainy but damning." Madison's voice echoed from a passenger's phone camera. "Maybe next time she'll know her place." The room went still. Her union rep gave a soft, pained sigh. "Madison, I told you not to speak that way, especially after a situation like this." Madison's voice broke slightly. "I didn't mean it like that. I was frustrated. I felt undermined on my own flight." "You weren't undermined," the HR officer said coolly. "You were held accountable. There's a difference." As the meeting dragged on, more testimony emerged. Casey, the young flight attendant who had served alongside Madison that day, had submitted a written statement. In it, he described feeling deeply uncomfortable with how Madison treated Ebony. He also admitted that Madison's behavior had veered into bias more than once in the past, especially during interactions with passengers of color. In previous incidents, Madison had been quietly counseled but never formally disciplined. But this time, her actions had played out on a global stage. The court of public opinion had delivered its verdict. And now Delta's internal leadership had no choice but to follow suit. By the end of the meeting, Madison sat hunched in her chair, her shoulders trembling. "Effective immediately, the HR officer announced you are being placed on indefinite leave without pay. This is pending final termination, subject to review by the Ethics Board. Your employee badge and access credentials must be surrendered today." Madison's breath caught. "You're firing me. After 10 years, you're being held accountable," came the response, echoing the same phrase that had shattered her defense minutes earlier. As she left the building that day, escorted by security to the parking lot, Madison looked more like a ghost of the woman who once barked orders at Ebony with such confidence. Her name had become synonymous with a corporate scandal, her career in aviation likely over. Back in Atlanta, Ebony was informed of the disciplinary outcome. She read the memo quietly in her office. The words "indefinite suspension code of conduct violation" and non-compliance with inclusion standards were clinical cold even. But the weight of their meaning was not lost on her. Her reaction was complex. She felt a sense of closure, a vindication, yes. Madison's removal meant the system had responded. Yet Ebony also understood that punishing one person didn't uproot decades of institutional behavior. Prejudice, after all, wasn't confined to one uniform. Still, change had to start somewhere. Shortly after Madison's dismissal, Delta announced the rollout of a comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI program. Every staff member, from gate agents to senior pilots, would now be required to complete cultural competency training. Delta also proposed a new passenger feedback platform, where incidents of bias could be reported directly and reviewed by an independent oversight team. Ebony was asked to join the advisory board, that would oversee the implementation of these changes. She accepted, but not without setting conditions. No performative measures, she said bluntly in a meeting with Delta's CEO. I want measurable results, annual reports, staff evaluations, an end to silent tolerance. You'll have them, the CEO assured. And so a woman once asked to leave first class was now helping reshape the very system that tried to eject her. Ebony's voice now echoed in boardrooms. Her fingerprints were embedded in policy changes. Her legacy was already being built, one scholarship, one conversation, one reform at a time. And as for Madison, she faded quietly into the background, her name known now not for leadership but for being a turning point, a cautionary tale etched into the memory of an airline that would never forget her mistake or the woman who turned that mistake into movement. 2 months after the incident that shook Delta's image and reverberated across social media, Ebony Davis found herself standing in the heart of Delta's Atlanta headquarters, this time not as a scrutinized passenger, but as a celebrated partner. The auditorium was bathed in natural light, streaming through high windows. A fresh blue and gold banner stretched across the main wall. Delta and Bridging, Tomorrow Scholarship Launch Event. Rows of neatly arranged chairs were filled with young faces, wide-eyed high school graduates, ambitious undergraduates, and proud families brimming with hope. Behind the podium stood executives from both Delta and Ebony's nonprofit. The air buzzed with nervous anticipation and cautious excitement. Cameras were positioned along the sides of the room, ready to broadcast a moment months in the making. Ebony adjusted her blazer and smoothed her skirt with careful poise. Her presence at the event wasn't just symbolic. It was revolutionary. She had returned not with vengeance, but with vision. Despite the sting of the flight attendant's humiliation and the storm that followed, Ebony had chosen not to walk away. Instead, she leaned in. Hard. The scholarship program, originally intended as a gesture of goodwill, had become a beacon of reform. What started as a $5 million donation had evolved into a full-blown partnership. After rigorous back-and-forth negotiations, Delta had agreed not only to publicly apologize, but to implement tangible reforms. And today's event was proof of that progress. Patricia Markham, the Vice President of Community Outreach, stepped to the podium, her voice warm and composed. Thank you all for being here on this historic day. We are proud to announce the official launch of our scholarship program in partnership with Bridging Tomorrow, a program that represents more than financial aid. It symbolizes access equity and accountability. The audience applauded, many standing as Patricia gestured for Ebony to join her on stage. Ebony walked up to the platform, her heels clicking against the polished wood floor, echoing like a steady drumbeat of change. Standing behind the microphone, she took a deep breath. She looked over the sea of hopeful faces, students who reminded her of herself. Ambitious, underestimated, and determined to defy expectations. 2 months ago, Ebony began her voice carrying firm and clear. I boarded a Delta flight, hoping to finalize this very program. Instead, I was met with discrimination and doubt about whether I belonged in a seat I had rightfully paid for. What happened challenged me, not just as a donor, but as a Black woman, a leader and a human being. She paused. A respectful silence stretched across the room. But I'm standing here today, she continued, not because of what tried to stop me, but because of what pushed me forward. That moment could have ended everything. Instead, it birthed a new beginning. Soft murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Students leaned in closer, hanging on her every word. Today, thanks to our partnership, she said, we are awarding scholarships to over 200 students from underrepresented communities. These young minds will go on to become pilots, engineers, innovators, and leaders in aviation. They are the future we've been waiting for. Thunderous applause broke out across the auditorium. A few students dabbed tears from their eyes. Others clutched hands with their parents or mentors, overwhelmed by the gravity of what this day meant. After her speech, Ebony remained on stage as the first wave of scholarship recipients was called forward. Each student shook hands with Delta executives and received a commemorative certificate. Ebony made a point to greet each one personally, offering hugs, high fives, or a whispered word of encouragement. One young woman, Fiona, with tightly coiled braids and bright, searching eyes, approached, hesitantly. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted her certificate. "I almost didn't apply," she admitted in a hushed voice. "I didn't think people like me belonged in aviation." Ebony's heart clenched. She gently cupped Fiona's hand in hers and said, "You belong anywhere you dream of being. Don't ever let someone else's ignorance define your sky." Fiona nodded, tears gathering in her lashes. "Thank you for fighting back. Not just for yourself, but for all of us." Those words would stay with Ebony long after the ceremony ended. As the event wound down, cameras flashed while Delta's CEO shook hands with Ebony for a final photo. There was a sense of redemption in the room, not complete, but meaningful. The company had taken a fall, but they had also taken responsibility. Later, as the auditorium emptied and the clamor quieted, Ebony found a moment to herself near the stage's edge. She looked around at the now empty seats, recalling the sea of faces that had once filled them. This was what victory looked like, not a headline, not a viral video, but a life changed, multiplied 200 times. The humiliation she endured had not been erased, but it had been transformed. Delta's leadership still had more to prove. But today, Ebony felt the winds had shifted. The sky didn't just belong to those with privilege. It belonged to those who dared to claim it. And Ebony Davis had done more than claim it. She'd cleared the runway for others to soar. And there you have it. The story of Ebony Davis, who refused to bow to prejudice and instead channeled her resolve into igniting systemic change. Her confrontation at 35,000 feet began as a humiliating ordeal, but transformed into a wake-up call for one of the world's leading airlines. In the end, that $5 million donation wasn't just a figure on a check. It was a moral investment that forced Delta to reckon with its own values, reshaping training policies and possibilities for future generations. Ebony's journey reminds us that sometimes the hardest battles birth the brightest triumphs. Enjoyed this story? Show some love by hitting that like button. Share it to spark conversations about bias equality and the power of standing up for what's right. And subscribe to our channel for more eye-opening stories that prove one person's determination can change an entire system. Thank you for listening. Together we can rewrite the future for the better.